ABC General Hospital spoilers reveal that the moment Sidwell finally saw it with his own eyes was the moment everything shifted. Until then, Lucas had been operating in the fragile space between suspicion and proof, convincing himself that caution and timing would be enough to outmaneuver a man like Sidwell. But when Sidwell stepped out from the shadows of Windermere's stone corridor and caught sight of Lucas slipping the vial into his pocket, the illusion of control shattered. What had once been a covert rescue mission for Britt instantly transformed into a full-scale crisis, and the balance of power on Spoon Island tilted with terrifying speed. Lucas had believed he was careful. He had mapped out guard rotations, memorized camera blind spots, and waited for the precise lull in activity when even the most vigilant observers seemed to relax. He had told himself that desperation justified risk, that freeing Britt from the nightmare engineered around her was worth stepping into danger. But he underestimated one critical factor: Sidwell's patience. Sidwell had not relied solely on cameras or reports. He had relied on instinct, and his instinct had been screaming that Lucas was not as compliant as he pretended to be. So he watched, quietly, closely, and when Lucas finally made his move, Sidwell was there. The confrontation did not need raised voices to become explosive. The silence itself was suffocating. Lucas turned, the vial cold against his palm, and saw the calculated fury in Sidwell's eyes. It was not the uncontrolled rage of a man surprised. It was the contained detonation of someone who had expected betrayal and had just been proven right. In that instant, the narrative Lucas had clung to, that he could outsmart this operation and slip away unnoticed, collapsed. Sidwell did not look shocked. He looked vindicated. What followed was swift and merciless. Lucas was restrained before he could even consider escape. The vial was confiscated, examined, and held up like evidence in a trial that had already reached its verdict. Sidwell did not need Lucas to confess. The act itself was enough. And with that, the internal adjustments that had been simmering beneath the surface of Sidwell's operation erupted into open escalation. Sidwell had tolerated Lucas's presence as long as he remained useful. Now, usefulness had been replaced with liability. The arrest sent ripples through every corner of the island. Security tightened within minutes. Access routes were locked down. Anyone even remotely connected to Lucas found themselves under scrutiny. The quiet tension that had characterized the atmosphere before now gave way to overt paranoia. Sidwell made it clear that this was not merely about stolen medication, it was about defiance. About challenging his authority inside his own fortress. And that was something he would not allow to stand. For Lucas, the realization was brutal. He had told himself that being caught was a possibility, but he had never truly imagined the speed with which his world could narrow to a single locked room. His attempt to help Britt and act rooted in loyalty and love had now placed him at the center of a power struggle far bigger than he had anticipated. Sidwell did not just see a thief. He saw a threat to the structure he had carefully built. And threats, in Sidwell's world, were eliminated. Sidwell's fury was not theatrical. It was strategic. He understood the message this incident could send if handled improperly. If word spread that someone within Windermere could steal from him, it would weaken the aura of control he cultivated. So the response had to be decisive. Lucas's capture was not only punishment, it was demonstration. A reminder to everyone watching that betrayal carried consequences. The fallout extended beyond the immediate arrest. Marco, forced to confront the reality of Lucas's actions, found himself caught in the crossfire of loyalty and survival. Questions about trust surfaced with sharp edges. Had Lucas been deceiving him all along? Or had he simply chosen a moral line that Marco was unwilling to cross? Sidwell, ever perceptive, recognized the fracture forming and subtly widened it. Division among potential allies ensured isolation for Lucas. And isolation was power. Meanwhile, Britt's situation grew even more precarious. The very act meant to secure her freedom now tightened the grip around her. Sidwell interpreted Lucas's theft as confirmation that Britt inspired resistance, that her presence could destabilize the order he enforced. That realization prompted yet another adjustment in his strategy. Control would intensify. Oversight would increase. Any illusion that Britt might quietly endure her circumstances vanished. Lucas's attempt to save her had inadvertently escalated her danger. The psychological warfare began almost immediately. Lucas was not subjected to impulsive violence. Instead, Sidwell applied pressure in calculated increments. Information was withheld. Time blurred. Uncertainty became a weapon. Lucas understood that his capture was only the beginning. Sidwell would want to know who else knew, who else doubted, who else might dare to challenge him. Even if Lucas had acted alone, suspicion would spread like wildfire. What made the situation truly explosive was the shift in perception among those observing from the sidelines. Before, Lucas had been a variable, unpredictable, but manageable. Now, he was proof that resistance existed. Some might see his capture as a warning, others might see it as inspiration. Sidwell sensed that possibility and moved quickly to control the narrative. Lucas would be framed not as a hero, but as reckless, irresponsible, a destabilizing element whose actions endangered everyone. Yet beneath Sidwell's calculated exterior burned genuine anger. Lucas had forced his hand, had exposed a crack in the system. Even the most powerful orchestrator hates being surprised, and Lucas's theft had created a moment Sidwell did not script. That loss of absolute control fueled the intensity of his response. It was no longer just about maintaining order. It was about reasserting dominance. As the island buzzed with tension, one truth became undeniable. This was no minor incident. It was a turning point. Lucas's arrest marked the transition from covert maneuvering to open conflict. Lines were being drawn, loyalties tested. The consequences of a single stolen vial had ignited a chain reaction that threatened to engulf everyone involved. Lucas sat in confinement, replaying the moment over and over, the flicker of recognition in Sidwell's eyes, the sound of approaching footsteps, the weight of the vial in his hand. He had known the risk. He had chosen it anyway. And now, the explosion he had hoped to prevent had detonated at his feet. But even in the face of confinement, one thought persisted. If his capture exposed the cruelty behind Sidwell's empire, then perhaps the chaos unfolding was not entirely in vain. Sidwell, meanwhile, prepared his next move. Arrest was only the first act. What followed would determine whether this rebellion was extinguished, or whether it would spread. And as the tension tightened like a coiled spring, it became clear that Spoon Island was no longer a place of quiet manipulation. It was a battleground, and the war had just begun. Lucas did not expect confession to feel heavier than chains, but when he finally allowed himself to speak the truth, it was as if the last fragile shield protecting him shattered. In the dim isolation where Sidwell intended to break his resolve, Lucas stopped pretending. He admitted what had driven him, admitted that stealing the medication was never about recklessness or ego. It was about Brit. It was about refusing to stand by while Sidwell manipulated lives like expendable pieces on a board. And more than anything, it was about the unbearable realization that he could not survive this alone. For the first time, Lucas understood that escape was no longer a solo mission. The network around him was too tightly woven, the surveillance too precise, the consequences too fatal. He needed Marco. Not as a romantic ally, not as a passive observer, but as an active force willing to fracture the system from within. That admission alone was dangerous. It meant trusting someone whose loyalty had been divided from the beginning, between love and blood, between conscience and a father's shadow. When Marco entered the room and saw the bruises lining Lucas's wrists, something shifted behind his eyes. Lucas did not waste time on pride. He confessed everything. His fear, his desperation, the certainty that Sidwell would not stop at imprisonment. Lucas did not frame himself as a hero. He framed himself as someone who had run out of options. And in that raw honesty, Marco saw something Sidwell had never accounted for, conviction that could not be engineered or controlled. Marco had grown up under Sidwell's calculated authority. He knew the weight of that name, the silent expectations, the cold precision with which mistakes were handled. Loyalty had never been optional in that household. It had been survival. Yet standing before Lucas, Marco faced a fracture he could no longer ignore. Supporting Sidwell meant endorsing cruelty. Saving Lucas meant detonating the very structure that had defined his life. The decision did not unfold in a dramatic declaration. It unfolded in silence, in the subtle shift of Marco's posture, in the way he stopped avoiding Lucas's gaze. Betrayal, when it came, was not impulsive, it was deliberate. Marco chose Lucas, and with that choice, he set fire to everything. The plan to free Lucas had to be precise. Sidwell's operation did not tolerate loose ends. Marco understood the security patterns, the coded clearances, the hidden redundancies designed to prevent exactly this scenario. He also understood his father's greatest weakness, arrogance. Sidwell believed loyalty was inherited. He believed his son would never dare undermine him. That belief became the opening. Marco began small, a delayed report, a misdirected guard, a temporary override that looked like a technical glitch. Each adjustment was subtle, almost invisible, but together they formed a path. Lucas, still confined, sensed the shift before he saw it. Doors that should have remained locked hesitated. Surveillance rotations grew inconsistent. The system was faltering from within. When the moment came, it was swift. Marco entered under the guise of interrogation clearance. Instead of questions, he brought a keycard and a warning. Once they stepped through that door, there would be no return. Lucas did not hesitate. Freedom, even uncertain and hunted, was better than waiting for a sentence that might end in execution. Their escape triggered alarms within minutes. Sidwell watched the feeds in disbelief as anomalies multiplied. At first, he assumed sabotage from outside forces, rivals, enemies. But the deeper he traced the disruptions, the clearer the pattern became. The overrides originated from access codes that only a handful possessed, and one of those codes belonged to Marco. Shock did not register on Sidwell's face easily. He was a man who thrived on anticipation. But when confirmation arrived, when footage revealed Marco leading Lucas through a restricted corridor, something inside him fractured. This was not betrayal from an outsider. This was blood, turning against blood. His son had not only defied him, he had humiliated him. The emotional detonation was as intense as the operational one. Sidwell's empire was built on control, on the certainty that every piece would move exactly as he directed. Marco's defection exposed a vulnerability no rival could exploit more effectively. It proved that loyalty under fear had limits. It proved that his own household was not immune to dissent. Rage rippled through his orders. Lockdowns intensified. Interception teams were deployed. But beneath the strategic response burned something far more personal. Sidwell had groomed Marco to inherit power, to understand the necessity of ruthless decisions. To see that son now dismantling his authority for the sake of Lucas was an insult that cut deeper than any external threat. Meanwhile, Lucas and Marco fled through corridors that suddenly felt alive with pursuit. Every step was a countdown. Lucas knew that Marco had sacrificed more than position, he had sacrificed protection. From this point forward, Marco was no longer shielded by his father's name. He was a target. The disaster unfolding was not limited to one escape. It was systemic. Marco's betrayal forced a recalibration of alliances across the island. Guards questioned orders. Operatives wondered what else might fracture. The certainty that Sidwell's grip was unbreakable had been cracked, and cracks, once visible, spread. Sidwell confronted the truth in private before he acted publicly. His son had chosen love over legacy, compassion over control, and that choice threatened everything he stood for. The narrative had shifted from managing a prisoner to suppressing a rebellion that began in his own family. Yet even as fury consumed him, Sidwell understood the symbolism of this moment. If he responded purely as a father, he appeared weak. If he responded purely as a commander, he risked losing the last remnants of personal loyalty. The balance between vengeance and authority became razor-thin. Lucas, aware of the storm behind them, felt the weight of Marco's sacrifice. Confession had not been weakness, it had been the catalyst. By admitting he needed help, he had sparked a chain reaction that no one could now contain. Freedom was within reach, but it came wrapped in catastrophe. And as sirens echoed through the compound and Sidwell's command center erupted into controlled chaos, one truth became undeniable. This was no longer a covert struggle. It was open war. A son had betrayed his father. A prisoner had become a symbol. And Sidwell, for the first time in a long time, was not entirely certain he could predict the ending.